Hey everyone, we're going to get right into the passage of the week. Going to read that for you guys, and then we're going to be talking about chapter 9 of the book American Conspiracies by Jesse Ventura. He talks about, in his opinion, his view, the first stolen election our country went through. Our passage of the week is from 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15 says, "The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, which giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. For as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." And that is 1 Corinthians 15, 56 to 58. In Christ we have victory. That's an important thing to always remember. It's important to have the right mindset in life. I was reminded recently, I was thinking about a teacher in my Sunday school class, and he was talking about how his dad is like, always have a low expectation of life, so then you're always pleasantly surprised. Started laughing and said, guys, it just doesn't work like that. And it's true. When you live a life knowing that Christ is victorious and so are you, it changes your outlook. You start looking for the good parts of life. There are certain people out there, maybe even some of you listening to this, and your personal life stinks right now and it's really hard. But it will get better. And even if you have a really hard time for a long time, pray and try to see the good side, try to see the positive side. That's very important for anyone in life. We're called in this verse to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain, in the Lord. We should be steadfast, unmovable. There's a lot about perseverance there. We should always abound in the work of the Lord. We should always have His goals in our mind throughout all of life. That's an important thing for me, is I want you guys to remember me, yes, for my political commentary, but also for my love for God. And that's an important thing to remember, because He is with us. He is immovable. He is steadfast. And we need to hang on to the truths He's given us in His Word, the Bible. Before I go any further, I just want to very briefly remind you guys to comment on this. That is the best way you can support me. You don't even have to give money to support me. You can support me by commenting on this episode and pressing the like button. That would really help me a lot. If you haven't already, if you're listening to this for the first time, please subscribe on YouTube if it's there, Twitter, Rumble, and Odyssey, depending on where you're listening. There's links in the description. Go to thefogandthewhirlwind.substack.com/subscribe. thefogandthewhirlwind.substack.com/subscribe. Subscribe for free, and if you're able to give a donation, I would really appreciate it. If you're able to support me monthly. If you are a paid supporter, you get exclusive content and admission to the private supporters of the Fog and the Whirlwind group chat. Following me on social media is also easy. Telegram is Fog and Whirlwind. It's t.me/Fog and Whirlwind. I've decided to go back to Fog and Whirlwind on Twitter as well, or X. I typically refer to it as X. At Fog and Whirlwind. Instagram is also Fog and Whirlwind, and so is Gab. Fog and Whirlwind. All right, let's get into the chapter. I'll be doing what I usually do, which is to read this chapter. Then I will tell you guys what I think about it. This is chapter 9 from the book American Conspiracies by Jesse Ventura. October surprise, the first stolen election. What happened? On the same day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, January the 20th, 1981, Iran released the American hostages it had been holding in our embassy there for 444 days. The official word was that the timing was coincidental. Jesse Ventura's take: Reagan's people had cut a deal with Iran. Appalachian accent's kind of thick. Iran, to keep the hostages beyond the presidential election, to ensure that President Carter's negotiation with Iran failed and that he lost to Reagan. Concentrated power has always been the enemy of liberty. Ronald Reagan. How can a president not be an actor? Ronald Reagan. If you're like me, maybe you wondered a little about the timing. Within an hour after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president on January the 20th, 1981, the government of Iran released all but one of the 52 American hostages they've been holding for 444 days. The American people rejoiced. The long ordeal that began when militant Muslims took over the American embassy in Tehran was over. But what if those hostages could actually have gained their freedom months earlier? And if Jimmy Carter had been successful in his negotiations, what if he'd been reelected to a second term? What if the Reagan Bush team cut a secret deal with Iran to hold on to their American prisoners until after the November election? Would anybody call that treason? Even at the time, as busy on the wrestling circuit as I was, I thought, what? This stinks. It reeked of a behind-the-scenes deal. Here's the thing everybody forgets. Even though Reagan ended up swamping Carter in the election as late as in the middle of October, Reagan's own poll taker had Carter ahead by 2 percentage points. If Carter had managed to free the hostages before the election, good chance he'd have won. Instead, we had what Gary Sick, both Ford and Carter's Middle East expert on the National Security Council, called a political coup in his book October Surprise. Most of us remember Operation Desert One, a hostage rescue attempt by our military early in 1980 that ended up dead in the desert, got 8 Americans killed, and resulted as a major embarrassment for Carter. During negotiations after that, Iran was demanding of the Carter people that we exchanged $150 million in American military equipment that they'd already ordered and paid for before the Shah was overthrown and the Ayatollah Khamenei took power. Carter said he wouldn't deal with arms merchants, but otherwise thought this seemed fair enough. Meantime, the Reagan campaign was busy monitoring Carter's every move on this. As early as March 1980, William Casey, who was then managing Reagan's election campaign and later was named his CIA director, approached 2 Iranian wheeler dealers in Washington. The Hashemi brothers, Rashid and Cyrus, were asked if they'd set up a meeting with some representatives of the government. The thing was, Cyrus Hashemi, who'd done some work for the CIA, was also an important intermediary for the Carter White House in the talks. Anyway, what was basically a bidding war proceeded from there. Casey went to Spain in July and worked out arrangements to get arms to the Iranians from several locations in Europe by way of Israel once the hostages were freed. The equipment was worth billions and involved arms dealers, not to mention $40 million in bribes going to various individuals. Abul Banai Sadr, president of Iran at the time, later wrote about the secret deal in 2 books. One of Khamenei's nephews was supposed to present Iran with a proposal from Carter, but he instead returned home with one from the Reagan camp. Bani Sadr was told that if he didn't accept it, the Republicans would make the same offer to his radical rivals. Lastly, he told me my refusal of their offer would result in my elimination. Bani Sadr said he first resisted and tried to get the hostages released right away. That had already been an official agreement with Carter done in Algeria, but not surprisingly, Ayatollah Khamenei was working both sides of the street. A secret plan by the Carter administration for a second hostage rescue mission went operational in September, but it was leaked to Richard V. Allen, soon to be Reagan's national security advisor. Shortly thereafter, the Reagan Bush campaign launched a major publicity effort warning that President Carter might be planning an October surprise to obtain the release of the hostages prior to the election. That fall, Cyrus Hashemi received a $3 million deposit arranged by a Houston lawyer who was associated with vice presidential candidate Bush. Around that time came a meeting in Paris that involved Bush himself, although the U.S. government and most of the media would do their best to pretend it never happened. Bush called it that ugly little word of mouth rumor. Playing their cards close to the vest, Iran's leadership was saying it wanted either Reagan or Bush to personally put their John Hancock on a final agreement. On September the 22nd, Iraq invaded Iran, which made Iran's need for war equipment all the more urgent. A series of meetings ensued over 5 days at different hotels in Paris. Bush and Casey are said to have arrived at the Paris Hilton for a 90-minute discussion to cut the final deal on October 19th. Secret Service spokesmen later claimed that Bush was in Washington that weekend, but their logs showed a missing 21 hours in his itinerary. There's nothing from the time of a speech he gave on a Saturday night until another speech that he arrived late for the next night, and other Secret Service documents that show he flew in a national airport at 7:35 p.m. on that Sunday. He left for Paris on a BAC 111 owned by one of the Saudi royal family and returned on a fast SR-71 aircraft that the CIA loaned him. At least 5 of the sources who say they were in Paris in connection with these meetings insist that George Bush was present for at least one meeting. 3 of the sources say they saw him there. Ari Ben Menashe, an ex-member of Mossad Israeli intelligence, said he'd been part of an advance team working with the French in arranging the meetings. CIA contract agent Richard Rennick testified under oath that he'd seen Bush, along with NSC official Donald Gregg, in the French capital that weekend. There was also an investigation overseen by Sergei V. Stefashin, who later became Russia's prime minister. On January the 11th, 1993, he had a six-page report translated by the American embassy in Moscow and forwarded to Congress. At the Paris meeting, the Russians independently learned Robert Gates, at the time a staffer of the National Security Council in the administration of Jimmy Carter, and former CIA Director George Bush also took part. Robert Gates, eh? Well, that brings us right to the present. Gates came in to replace Donald Rumsfeld as the defense secretary under Bush II, late in 2006, and Obama decided to keep him there. If truth be known, Gates had a shady history as a career intel guy. In 1991, there were accusations he'd brushed aside that he'd had a secret role in arming both sides in the Iraq-Iran war. Witnesses in the Middle East said they had included Saddam Hussein getting hold of cluster bombs and material for chemical weapons. Later, a sworn affidavit by one of Reagan's National Security Council guys said that when Iran was gaining the upper hand in the spring of 1982, the CIA, including both CIA Director Casey and Deputy Director Gates, knew of, approved of, and assisted in the sale of non-U.S. origin military weapons, ammunition, and vehicles to Iraq. It was also 1982 when the U.S. kindly removed Iraq from its list of terrorist states. Kind of makes you wonder about who our enemies really are, doesn't it? There the Republicans were, sending weapons around first to Iran to make sure Reagan got elected, then turning around and arming Saddam Hussein, right down to getting him stuff for chemical weapons that would justify W's invasion of Iraq 20 years later. And now today, it's all about demonizing another recipient of our generosity, Iran. Who's the real demon here? We are behind the scenes because we're the ones giving these countries weapons that they can turn around and use on us. It's utter craziness and so frustrating to watch our leaders operate with so little regard for human life. I'm a believer that if Congress and the media had been doing their job right when the October surprise story began coming out in the late 80s and early 90s, we'd have never gone to war in Iraq. In fact, there would, or at least should, have been impeachment proceedings against George Bush Sr., and that would have been it for the family and politics. No two-term presidency for Jr. Of course, it was Papa Bush who set the family precedent for stealing elections. Keep in mind that he'd been CIA director in 1976. Bush had also protected wayward or hot-triggered agency operatives, veterans of everything from Chilean assassinations to Vietnam's Phoenix program and improper domestic surveillance, from indictment by President Ford's Justice Department. Then Carter came along and replaced Bush with Stansfield Turner. The CIA's good old boy network hated Carter because Turner proceeded to clean house and dismiss many of the longtime covert operatives. But I digress. Let's pick up the 1980 story with the fact that right after the Paris meeting with Bush and Gates in attendance, Iran suddenly told the Carter administration it had no further interest in receiving military equipment. Then, over the next several days, Israel quietly shipped F-4 fighter aircraft tires to the Iranians, in violation of the U.S. arms embargo, while Iran started dispersing the hostages to different locations. So Carter lost the election, and then came the timed release, like a good sleeping pill, on Reagan's inauguration day. Banker Ernest Bax from Clearstream in Luxembourg later said he'd been in charge of a transfer of $7 million from Chase Manhattan and Citibank on January the 16th, 1980, to help pay for the hostages' liberation. According to Bani Sadr of Iran, we have published documents which show that U.S. arms were shipped via Israel in March, about 2 months after Reagan became president. Call me naive, but I just find it amazing how powerful people can do illegal things and so easily cover their tracks. If George Bush went over and used the hostages for pawns in a political game, shouldn't he and his cronies go to jail for that? I mean, let's make a comparison. Say some people were being held hostage in a bank, and you found out the lieutenant on the police force delayed getting them freed simply to advance his own personal agenda. Wouldn't you be appalled enough to think that officer should be fired or even stand trial for doing this? The hostages in Iran had been there for months. But ultimately, the Bush-Casey types figure, it's fine because we'll win the presidency and all will be better off. You sacrifice the few for the many, not really knowing whether the many are going to profit or not. It's like saying if somebody had killed Charles Manson a year before the Sharon Tate murders, none of those people would have died. Anyway, they'll violate all the laws of human decency to make sure Ronald Reagan gets elected. I've always believed you'll govern like you campaign. If you lie and cheat during the campaign, it's not going to end there. And of course, it didn't. Before long, we had the Iran-Contra scandal, which we'll look at in the next chapter. I angrily look at the American people and wonder how they can possibly accept this. We just throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, well, that's government. That's what they do. No, we need to understand. Government is us. The whole Simi saga surrounding the hostages started to unravel in 1987 when the Miami Herald published an article quoting some statements from a CIA agent, Alfonso Ciardi, about the secret October meetings. Also that year, Bani Sadr wrote a book that was published in Europe and got into some of what he knew. Playboy and Esquire followed up with articles. In 1989, Barbara Honegger came up with her book, October Surprise. She'd been a loyal Reagan staffer until she left out of disillusionment with some of the practices she'd observed. Honegger said she was present on Inauguration Day when she heard Reagan say to tell the Iranians the deal is off if that last hostage is not freed. Reagan had left office by the time of Honegger's book, and Papa Bush was just beginning his first term. In early November 1989, Ari Ben-Menashe was arrested in L.A. The Mossad agent was charged with having violated the U.S. Arms Export Control Act by attempting to sell Iran 3 C-130 transport planes with a false end-user certificate. Apparently, our left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. Israeli master spy Rafi Eitan was worried that Ben-Menashe was in a position to blow wide open the U.S.-Israeli arms to Iran network, whose tentacles had extended everywhere, down to Central and South America, through London into Australia, across to Africa, deep into Europe. Sure enough, Ben-Menashe was soon squawking to reporters. He implicated Bush and Gates in October Surprise. He talked of a secret American policy to send weapons through Chile to the Iraqis. We're playing both ends against the middle again. The government of Israel tried to discredit Ben-Menashe as a fabricator, but Associated Press journalist Robert Parry uncovered internal Israeli documents proving he'd worked for an arm of their military intelligence for a decade, 1977 to 1987. So the Israelis had some egg on their face, but meantime, both they and the White House were seeking out more friendly reporters. One of them was Stephen Emerson, who wrote that he'd seen derogatory records on the delusional Ben-Menashe. But corroboration for what Ben Menashe had to say did surface over time, including the Iraq weapons deal. A federal jury acquitted him of the charges at the end of 1990. Also in 1990, PBS's Frontline aired a program on the October surprise that included a soundbite of Reagan playing golf with Bush in Palm Springs and said he'd tried some things the other way to free the hostages, but that the details were classified. Oops, open mouth and insert foot, Mr. Former President. By now, there was enough outside pressure for the House of Representatives to form an October surprise task force in February 1992. The fellow who chaired the committee was Lee Hamilton, a bipartisan Democrat who from then on always seemed to end up in charge of these types of investigations. Next time would be the Iran-Contra hearings that made Oliver North a household name. Then Hamilton would be vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, whose shoddy work we'll look at later. Now he's retired after serving 34 years in the House, but he's still in Obama's Homeland Security Advisory Council. I guess they need expertise in cover-ups. Freudian slip. I mean, clandestine ops. The chief counsel for the House's October Surprise Task Force was a fella named Barcella, fresh from Larry's, having been lead attorney for the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI for short. BCCI had paid his firm more than $2 million to keep it shielded from investigations by the press or government agencies. When a reporter asked Barcella if he saw any conflict of interest since BCCI had helped finance arms deals to Iran in 1983, Barcella accused the man of McCarthy-like behavior. Well, you won't find BCCI mentioned once in the task force's report. Even though within days after William Casey became head of Reagan's CIA, BCCI officials, along with Iranian banker Cyrus Hashemi, set up 2 Hong Kong-based banks that were underwritten by $20 million in Iranian assets from the Shah's royal family. As for Barcella, he was apparently quite sensitive to the interests of the U.S. intelligence community during his days as a federal prosecutor. Given who was in charge, we just shouldn't be too surprised at the task force's conclusions. In 1993, the House report found no credible evidence supporting any attempt by the Reagan presidential campaign or persons associated with the campaign to delay the release of the American hostages in Iran. Lee Hamilton noted that the vast majority of sources for the allegation were wholesale fabricators or were impeached by documentary evidence. Washington Post columnist David Broder lauded Hamilton as the conscience of Congress for repudiating the accusations. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee also conducted a small-scale investigation. They had imposed travel restrictions on checking out leads in Europe, denied subpoena power, and claimed a shortage of funds. The Secret Service wouldn't allow any questioning of agents who might have gone with Bush to Paris. The Senate's report, issued on November the 19th, 1992, said, "The vast weight of all available evidence was that Bush never made that trip to cut a deal with Iran." William Casey was dead by now, and his family decided not to supply any of his records. Donald Gregg, a member of Bush's NSC staff after working more than 30 years for the CIA, failed a lie detector test on the matter, but the Senate committee would only say that Gregg's response was lacking in candor. The House found credible French intelligence sources about the Paris meetings, but still concluded somehow that it was all baseless. As for that report by the Russians, which ended up in Hamilton's hands 2 days before he was to announce the task force's conclusions, he instead took at face value a cable from an American embassy official in Moscow that the report might be based largely on material that has previously appeared in the Western media. Not the Times or the Post, I'll bet. The Russians continued to insist that the intel was their own and reliable. They considered the report a bomb and couldn't believe it was ignored. There's one journalistic hero in all this, and it's Robert Parry. He just kept plugging away. And in 1984, after he uncovered Oliver North's role in the Iran-Contra story for Newsweek, he was awarded the George Polk Award for National Reporting. Pretty soon, though, he was persona non grata with the establishment media, so he started Consortium News as an online magazine dedicated to investigative reporting. He's also written several books, and he's still out there pitching for truth. Most other journalists stayed the course with Lee Hamilton. Newsweek did a piece headlined, "The October Surprise Charge, Treason, Myth." And the New Republic called it, The Conspiracy That Wasn't. The author of that piece was Stephen Emerson, who is today considered one of our top authorities on Islamic extremists, their financing, and operations. Since 9/11, he's given many briefings to Congress on Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other networks. To say the least, he's a well-connected journalist. I can't let this chapter go without talking a little about Bill Clinton's reaction to it all after he defeated Bush to become president in 1992. Twice, emissaries from Iran told members of his cabinet about those Republican contacts with Islamic radicals close to Khamenei. But Clinton turned away, or at least his team did, not wanting to open themselves up to charges of playing politics. The Germans as well are said to have offered the Clinton administration information from their Stasi intel files, but whatever they turned over, Clinton kept secret. I sometimes get a strange sense of deja vu when I think of how the Obama administration now wants to put all of Bush II's torture policies behind this. So Jesse Ventura's conclusion, what should we do now? We need to realize that the precedent setter for one political party to steal a presidential election from another happened with Ronald Reagan, a man some would like to see join our greatest presidents on Mount Rushmore. Like the political assassinations earlier, this was a continuation of an ends justify the means mentality that will ultimately destroy our democracy altogether if we allow this attitude to continue. Also, let's consider how our friends so quickly become our enemies. Is it all about what suits certain people in power? Who's really benefiting from the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the demonization of Iran? Wow, there is so much in here that I think is just spot on. So one thing that I think I'll go ahead and hop right into is the stuff with the CIA. I mean, the CIA's hands are all over this. You've got Gates, you've got Bush. There's some statements from this guy, Alfonso Chardy, and it's just really interesting to see all these connections to the CIA. Now, the other thing that I think is important to say at the outset before I even go any further about specifics is it's about time that the Republican Party get out of Ronald Reagan's shadow. Because I'll tell you, whenever I look at Iran-Contra, and I'm going to read about it obviously to you guys, I think there's a lot of smoke there, and there's probably some fire. Now, did Reagan completely do everything? As far as, was he aware of everything? No, but he may have been negligent. And that's a problem too. You can't be negligent. He may have been negligent and said, I don't really care how this gets done, just get it done. And told the CIA, FBI, military intelligence to do whatever. And I do think he had to have known about some of it. And as we go into Iran-Contra, whenever I read to you about it in another episode, in fact, is that the next one? Yeah, it is. The next one I'll read to you will be about Iran-Contra. But when it comes specifically to Iran, is it that surprising after listening to, for example, the Tucker Carlson interview with Jeffrey Sachs, or the Tucker Carlson interview with Thomas Massey, where Massey mentions AIPAC? Is it that surprising that this Mossad agent, Ari Ben Menashe, had some hand in this? That it sounds like, based on what Ventura has covered here, the F-22s were brought through brought through Israel and given to Iran. In what way does that make sense? Like, why in the world is our government doing that? It makes you wonder, with all the demonization of Russia or China, if there's any backroom deals going on there. And similarly, with the Biden administration, you just have to wonder. I mean, they've probably gotten a lot better at not being so sloppy with all this talk about, hashtag stand with Israel. And, Biden's had a very, very complicated message on that. He's been kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth. But with the talking about, also wanting to give aid, humanitarian aid to Palestine or Palestinian people, has he been sending them weapons as well and sending aid to Israel? Makes you wonder, doesn't it, after reading this, funding both sides of a war and doing things secretly through our CIA? It's troubling, very troubling. And the thing is, with us using Israel to do this, I'm sure there was a this for that. What kickbacks, what benefit did Israel get from that? And Ventura kind of goes into it. He ultimately was talking about how with the war drums beating against Iran and against Iraq, some of the agenda for the wars. And Jeffrey Sachs, and again, I'm listening to that one right now, the Jeffrey Sachs versus Tucker Carlson interview. You guys really need to listen to it. And he's actually had him on more than once. I think he's had him on twice. Once was a few months ago, and I say this to you on the 19th of December of 2024. A few months ago, he did an interview, but also very recently, like a couple of days ago, he had him back on. And Jeffrey Sachs, who's from a Jewish family, embarrassing I have to say it, but there it is, because there's certain people that are just bad actors. Jeffrey Sachs mentions that a lot of American foreign policy is in chains and contingent and tied to Israel. We do what they tell us to, and they give us financial incentive to. We give them financial incentive to do all kinds of corrupt stuff. And really, though, when it comes to the money and the power, a lot of it is Israel influencing us because they want to be the biggest player in the Middle East. They want a lot of territory from Syria and countries like that. Go listen to the episode for yourself. So it's not that surprising that Israel had ties to this right here. It is interesting to me, I will say, every time I read this book, I say to myself, wow, same cast of characters. Like, for example, this Lee Hamilton guy who then was in charge of Iran-Contra and then 9/11. You know, this guy, and then at the time that Ventura wrote this, he was on Obama's Homeland Security Advisory Council. It just is all the same people. It's all the same deep state. It's all the same bad actors. You know, sometimes people change, but not much. It's a lot of the same people most of the time. All right, if you're watching this on video and I look different, it's because I had to do a separate take. So we're going to just jump back into what I think about this. I think it's very important to think about the military-industrial complex when reading this, when thinking about this, because they always have their ways. There are things that they want to do, and they find ways to achieve them. And in the short term, that looks a little weird because, like, well, you're giving money or weapons to Iran. Why would you do that? Well, then in the long term, especially now, here in 2024, when the war drums against Iran are beating and beating hard, it begins to look a little bit more clear. So I want you guys to reflect on that, think about it. The best way for you guys to help me out would be to comment on this. Make sure that you are commenting. That would help a lot. You can do that for free. That's the best way to support me for free, is to comment. So definitely do that. You also can help me by going to, as I said before, the fogandwhirlwind.substack.com/subscribe. I'm going to be doing more live streams, and I want you guys to be able to tune in. But there's also going to be a decent amount of pre-recorded content for you guys. I've got a lot. There's some stuff I want to talk about here in this book, American Conspiracies by Jesse Ventura, but I also want to talk to you about some current news. And so I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys about that. Thank you for all of your support. Hope you have a great evening and take care. Remember, there is no king but Christ. Christ is king. He is the Lord. Above all, he's on the throne.